The mother gorilla hadn't moved from that spot in over an hour. Those scavengers circling the grass already sensed it, that stillness that separates an animal fighting to survive from one that is simply waiting to lose. They tightened their circle slowly, the way patient things do when they believe time is already on their side. But she didn't retreat. She didn't call out. She just stood there, injured, exhausted, with her baby pressed against her back. And then she did something that stopped everyone watching. Ranger, medic, and predator alike. Dear viewers, before we continue, please write in the comments where you are watching from. We are genuinely curious to know which city or country you are joining us from today. Enjoy the story. The gorilla known to the Rangers as Casey had lived in the protected forest reserve for more than 12 years. She was not the largest female in her troop, nor the most dominant, but she had earned a quiet kind of respect among the Rangers who monitored the area regularly. Because in 12 years, through dry seasons and territorial disputes and the slow encroachment of the world beyond the tree line, she had never once abandoned a member of her family. She had raised 2 offspring before this one. Both survived. Both stayed close to the troop. The Rangers who had watched her long enough said she moved through the forest with a kind of deliberate calm that was unusual even for an experienced female. Never reckless, never rattled, always reading the space around her before committing to a direction. Her baby, barely 4 months old, had not yet been given a name in any official record. He was too young, too new. But the ranger who had first spotted him 3 weeks earlier had quietly started calling him Tomo, a small private thing that field workers sometimes do when an animal gets under their skin before they realize it has happened. Ray had been working the Eastern Patrol Corridor for nearly 6 years. He knew this stretch of land the way most people know the inside of their own homes, the dry creek bed that flooded without warning, the fig trees that drew animals out of cover in late afternoon, the soft spots in the soil that told you something heavy had passed through recently. So when his radio crackled with a report of unusual movement near the boundary between the forest and the open grassland, he didn't wait for a second call. Animals didn't drift toward open land without a reason, and the reasons were rarely good. He reached the area on foot, moving quietly, staying low, keeping the wind at his back the way his supervisor had drilled into him during his first week on the job. He almost missed her entirely. She was standing in the partial shade of the tree line, half hidden by the shadow of the canopy above, and she wasn't moving. That was the first thing that told him something was wrong. A gorilla standing completely still in open ground, neither feeding nor moving, neither vocalizing nor retreating. That was not a relaxed animal. That was an animal in a state of controlled readiness. Her shoulders were drawn up high, her head turned slowly, deliberately, scanning left and then right. The baby on her back was silent in the way that young animals go silent when their mother's body language tells them that silence is survival. Ray stopped. He didn't reach for his radio yet. He just watched. Because sometimes the most important thing a ranger can do in those first few seconds is nothing at all. Then he saw the movement in the grass to her left. Not one animal, several, low shapes drifting through the dry vegetation at the kind of slow, patient pace that meant they weren't chasing, they were waiting, testing, looking for the moment when the larger animal would make a mistake, turn the wrong way, leave a gap. Casey had already seen them. She turned her body sideways, making herself look broader, angling the baby on her back away from the open field. It was a precise, deliberate movement. Not panic, not confusion. She knew exactly where the threat was, and she was managing the space between herself and it with the experience of an animal that had navigated danger before. Ray felt a slow chill move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had been pushed out of the forest cover, probably by something that had disturbed the troop further in, and now she was standing alone at the worst possible edge, with a baby on her back and no clean path back to safety. Every direction carried a cost, and she was calculating all of them at once. He reached for his radio and kept his voice flat and low. Backup. Eastern boundary, grid 7. Do not approach with vehicles. He gave the coordinates and clipped the radio back without taking his eyes off her. That was when she looked at him, not the frantic, startled look of an animal that had just noticed a human for the first time. She had known he was there. She had been tracking him the same way she had been tracking the shapes in the grass, quietly, carefully, filing the information away. Now she was simply deciding what category he belonged in. Danger, or something else. Ray didn't move. He didn't speak. He stood at a distance that he hoped communicated no urgency, no threat, nothing that would tip the balance of her assessment in the wrong direction. He had learned early in his career that wild animals don't respond to what you intend. They respond to what you do. And right now, the most important thing he could do was exist without pressure. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back toward the grass. The baby shifted on her back. It was a small movement, the kind a sleeping child makes when it stirs without fully waking, but Kessley reacted instantly. She reached one arm back, pressing Tomo gently against her body, steadying him without looking, a motion so practiced it had no hesitation in it at all. And that was when Ray saw it, the dark stain along her upper arm, the way she favored it slightly each time she shifted her weight. The stiffness in her left shoulder that he had almost written off as tension but now understood was something else entirely. She was injured, not a fresh wound from this moment, something older, something that had been slowing her down long before any of this started. She had been standing her ground, holding her position at the edge of that clearing, managing threats from two directions at once, all while carrying an injury that would have sent most animals retreating to rest hours ago. She had stayed, for the baby, only for the baby. Ray's throat tightened. He had seen a lot of animals in 6 years on this land. He had seen mothers defend their young in ways that were fierce and fast and loud. But this was quieter than any of that. This was the kind of endurance that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just keeps going because stopping is not an option. Keski stepped back, just slightly toward the tree line. For a moment Ray thought she was finally going to do the logical thing, disappear into the forest, use the cover, put distance and darkness between herself and everything in that clearing. It would have been the right move, the safe move, the move every instinct she had was probably telling her to make. But she stopped. She turned, and she looked at Ray one more time, a long, steady look that lasted just a beat longer than any animal look he had ever received in his life. There was nothing magical in it, nothing that could be described as understanding or communication in any human sense. It was simply the look of an animal that had run out of good options and was measuring the ones that remained. Then slowly, with a care that seemed almost deliberate, she reached back with her uninjured arm and lowered the baby from her back. She had fought for Tomo with everything she had, her strength, her stillness, her endurance, and her pain. But what came next was something no field manual had ever prepared Ray for. Because what Casey did in the next few minutes wasn't instinct. It was a choice. Ray didn't move. Nobody did. The baby was on the ground now, just a few yards from where Casey stood, and the silence that followed was the kind that presses against your ears. The scavengers in the grass had gone still. The birds that had been calling from the upper canopy had stopped. Even the wind seemed to pull back, as if the clearing itself was holding its breath. Casey had not walked away. She was still close, close enough to close the distance in 2 seconds if she wanted to, with one hand resting near Tomo and her eyes moving between the grass and Ray in a slow, controlled sweep. She was not abandoning him. She was repositioning. There was a difference, and Ray understood it immediately, because the moment he took one small step forward, she shifted her weight and her shoulders came up. He stopped. She watched. He stepped back to where he had been. Her shoulders dropped, just slightly. That exchange lasted no more than 4 seconds, but it told Ray everything he needed to know about what kind of conversation the next hour was going to be. Tomo tried to move. He pushed his small arms against the ground and lifted his head, and for one brief moment it looked like he might pull himself upright the way healthy young gorillas do, fast and instinctive, built for it. But his arms buckled. He dropped back onto his side and lay there, breathing in short, shallow pulls, his eyes open but unfocused. Ray had seen dehydration in the field before. He recognized the weight of it, the way it flattened an animal's movements, made everything slower and heavier than it should be. Tomo wasn't just tired from being carried, he was depleted. Whatever had disrupted the troop and pushed Kessie out to this exposed edge of the forest had been going on long enough that the baby had gone without proper rest, without enough to drink, possibly without enough to eat. Kessie had not only been protecting him through all of it, she had been keeping him alive through all of it. The distinction hit Ray quietly, the way important things sometimes do, not all at once but in pieces, each one landing a little heavier than the last. His radio buzzed softly. Backup was 12 minutes out. A wildlife medic was with them. 12 minutes was a long time. He relayed the situation in short, careful words. Mother present. Baby on the ground appears weak. Mother is injured. Left arm. Do not approach fast. Do not use vehicles near the tree line. Come in quiet and come in slow. He clipped the radio and looked back at Kessie. She was watching him again, not the grass this time. Him. Her gaze moved to the radio on his vest, then back to his face, then down to Tomo, then back to Ray. It was the kind of attention that had nothing passive in it. She was reading him the way experienced animals read unfamiliar things, continuously, without pause, updating her assessment with every small piece of new information. Ray had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling of being studied. Then Kessie picked Tomo up. She gathered him carefully with her good arm, pressed him against her chest, and took 3 slow steps toward Ray, then stopped. Ray's breath caught. He didn't step back this time. He didn't step forward either. He just kept his hands visible and his body still, and let her do whatever she was working through. She set Tomo down again, closer than before, not close enough for Ray to reach, but closer, and she took one step back after she did it, creating a thin margin of space between herself and the baby that had not been there a moment ago. Then she looked at Ray with that same steady, calculating attention. He understood what was happening before he fully had words for it. She wasn't offering him the baby. She wasn't surrendering to the situation or asking for rescue in any way that resembled a human gesture. What she was doing was more specific than that, and in some ways more remarkable. She was running a test. She wanted to know whether Ray would move toward Tomo when given the opening, and more importantly, she wanted to see how he moved, fast or slow, reaching or careful, threatening or neutral. She was gathering information before making her next decision, and she was doing it under pressure, with an injury, while monitoring a threat that was still circling in the grass 30 yards away. Ray lowered himself slowly to one knee. He kept his hands open in front of him, below his chest, where she could see them clearly. He did not lean forward. He did not make a sound. He simply made himself smaller and waited, the same way he had learned to wait in the field when the situation required patience more than action. Casey watched him for a long moment. Then she looked at the grass, then back at Ray. The scavengers were pushing closer now, emboldened by the stillness, by the confusion of the scene in front of them. One had moved to the edge of the dry vegetation, and was no longer bothering to stay hidden. The pressure was building from that direction, slow and certain, and Ray knew that Casey felt it the way every wild animal feels a closing threat, not as a thought but as a physical weight pressing from the side. She was running out of time to decide. A sound came from the forest behind her, low, distant, resonant, the kind of call that carries through tree cover without effort. Another gorilla, close enough to hear, far enough not to be seen. Casey turned sharply toward it. Her whole body changed, the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, the quality of her attention. For a moment she looked like she might answer, like she might gather Tomo and move toward that sound, and disappear back into the cover where she belonged. Ray held completely still. Tomo made a small noise on the ground, weak and thin, barely a sound at all. Casey turned back. She looked at her baby, then at Ray, then at the grass where the shapes were still moving, still waiting, still patient in the way that hungry things are patient, and then, with the slow and certain weight of an animal that has considered every option and found only one that makes sense, she took 2 steps back from Tomo, not running, not retreating, just stepping back, creating space, leaving a gap just wide enough for a human to move into without triggering everything she still had left to give. Ray understood what that space meant. He also understood that it could close in an instant if he moved wrong. 12 years of living wild had not made Kazda trusting, it had made her precise, and precision in that moment was the only thing standing between Tomo and everything waiting in that grass. He took one breath, and he moved. One step. Ray moved slowly, the way you move when you know that speed is the one thing you cannot afford. His boots pressed into the dry ground without sound. His hands stayed open, held low, visible. He didn't look directly at Casey. He had learned long ago that direct eye contact with a threatened animal reads as challenge, and the last thing this moment needed was anything that felt like a challenge. He kept Tomo in his line of sight and moved toward him the way water moves, without edges, without urgency, without anything that announced itself. Casey didn't charge. She didn't retreat either. She stood at the distance she had chosen, and watched with the full, unblinking attention of an animal that has made a decision but not yet committed to trusting it. Ray reached Tomo and crouched beside him. He didn't lift him. Not yet. He placed the back of his hand near the baby's face first, letting him register the presence without the shock of being handled. Tomo's eyes moved toward the warmth. His breathing was shallow but steady. His fingers curled weakly against the ground. Depleted but alive, Ray pressed his radio quietly and gave the medic a single word. Come. He heard the team moving through the grass behind him, slow as instructed, spreading wide so they didn't approach in a tight group that might read as a threat. He didn't turn to watch them come. He kept his eyes forward, his body calm, his entire focus on the space between himself and Casey. She had seen the others moving, her weight shifted, her jaw tightened, but she held her position. The medic reached Ray's side and knelt without a word. She had done this long enough to know that talking was noise, and noise was risk. She opened the supply bag with careful hands, checked Tomo's gum color, his eyes, the tension in his small limbs. Her movements were practiced and economical, nothing wasted, nothing sudden. Casey took one fast step forward. Everyone froze. The medic didn't pull back. She didn't look up. She simply stopped moving and waited, her hands resting still on either side of Tomo, and let the moment settle at its own pace. 3 seconds passed. Maybe 4. Casey stopped. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze dropping to Tomo, and made a sound that was low and soft and unlike anything she had produced in the last hour. Not a warning, not a call, something quieter than both. Tomo answered her. It was barely a sound, thin and small, more vibration than voice, but it was there, and Casey heard it, and something in the set of her body changed the moment she did. The high tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly, not disappearing, just shifting. She had needed to know he could still answer her. The medic wrapped Tomo in a light blanket and lifted him carefully. Ray stood slowly alongside her, and the small team began moving toward the rescue vehicle parked at the far edge of the clearing. Step by step, no rush, no sudden movements, the way you carry something fragile across uncertain ground. Casey followed. Not close, not aggressive, but she followed, moving parallel to the group at her own distance, her eyes on the blanket in the medic's arms, her injured arm held slightly away from her body. She made no sound. She didn't try to close the gap. She just kept pace, as if she had decided that wherever Tomo was going, she would go that far too. The vehicle came into view. Ray slowed without being asked. The team slowed with him. Because what happened next, whether Casey stopped at the tree line or kept coming, whether she held her distance or made a move toward the vehicle, nobody knew. There was no protocol for this part. There was only the moment itself, and whatever she chose to do inside it. The medic reached the vehicle and turned to step inside. Casey stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the clearing, close enough to see everything, far enough to still be wild, and watched the door of the vehicle with the same steady, measuring attention she had given Ray from the very beginning of this afternoon. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the grass settling in the wind, and somewhere behind her, distant and low, the forest breathing. She had followed as far as she could. What happened on the other side of that door was beyond anything she could reach or control or protect against, and every person standing in that clearing knew, without saying it, that the next few seconds would determine whether the trust she had extended, slowly, painfully, against every instinct she had, would hold or break. The medic stepped into the vehicle with Tomo. Ray didn't close the door, not immediately. He stood beside it and watched Casey, who was still at the edge of the clearing, still holding that distance she had chosen for herself, close enough to see inside, far enough to remain where she belonged. Her breathing was visible now, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the injury on her arm catching the late afternoon light at an angle that made it look worse than it probably was. She was exhausted. Anyone watching could see that. 12 years of experience, all that endurance, all that stillness and calculation and controlled restraint, and it had cost her. The kind of tired she carried now wasn't the kind that one night of rest fixes. But she didn't leave. She stood and she listened, and after a moment she heard it, Tomo shifting inside the vehicle, the small sounds of an animal being handled carefully, the medic's quiet movements, the soft crinkle of the blanket being repositioned. Casey leaned forward just slightly. Ray stayed where he was and let her look. After a long moment she stepped back, one step, then another, not turning away, just creating distance, the way she had done in the clearing when she had made the hardest decision of that afternoon. It was the same movement, carrying the same meaning. She was not giving up. She was acknowledging something she couldn't change. Ray watched her go, back toward the tree line, back toward the shadow and the cover and the world she understood. She paused once at the edge, turned her head, and looked at the vehicle one final time. Then the forest took her. At the wildlife care unit, Tomo was treated through the night, fluids first, then rest, then careful monitoring of his temperature and responses. The staff worked quietly, keeping the environment calm, keeping stimulation low. He was young enough that recovery, if it came, would come faster than it would for an adult. His body was still in the business of growing, and growing things, when given what they need, have a way of returning to themselves. By the third day he was lifting his head without effort. By the end of the first week he was eating. The rangers monitoring the forest edge reported that Casey had been seen twice near the boundary, not distressed, not vocalizing, just present, watching the direction of the care unit the way animals sometimes watch the place where something important happened, as if the place itself holds information. Her injury was treated by a separate field team who had worked with her troop before. It was deep but clean. She would carry the scar, but she would heal. 3 weeks later, on a quiet morning with no crowd and no noise, the team brought Tomo back. They parked at the same tree line, left the doors open, kept their distance. No one spoke above a whisper, the kind of stillness you hold when you know that what happens next belongs entirely to someone else. They didn't have to wait long. Casey came out of the forest slowly, the way she did everything, deliberately, reading the space before committing to it. She stopped when she saw the vehicle, Then she saw the medic crouching near the ground, and then she saw Tomo. He made the same small sound he had made in the clearing that afternoon, thin and soft, barely a sound at all, the sound that had made her turn back when every instinct was pulling her toward the forest. She crossed the distance between them without hesitation. She gathered him close, checked him with her hands the way mothers do, turned him gently, pressed her face against him. He held on. His fingers found the fur at her shoulder and buried themselves in it, the same way they had been on that first afternoon when all of this began. Ray stood at the edge of the clearing and watched and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying better. She had tried to save him with strength. When strength wasn't enough, she had tried with stillness. When stillness wasn't enough, she had done the one thing that cost her the most. She had stepped back and trusted something she had no reason to trust. Not because she understood rescue, not because she knew what a care unit was or what a medic could do or what any of it meant, but because she had looked at everything available to her in that clearing and chosen the option that gave Tomo a chance, even if it gave her nothing. In the wild, where survival is the only currency that matters, choosing hope over certainty is the bravest thing there is. She had done it without hesitation, and she had been right. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that love in any form, in any species, finds a way. We will see you in the next one.